Yes, it is time for Ricky's Reviews Retro, and this time we're going to talk about an RPG game, namely the game Crystalis for the Nintendo Entertainment System, released in 1990. And this is probably one of those games that a lot of people have not heard about. Everyone knows about Zelda, and there was other attempts of doing kind of the same as what Zelda did at that time, and Crystalis is more or less one of those games, but it also has a little bit of a special place in the few people who actually remembers this game in their hearts, because it actually took RPG genre to the trial for the first time on a home console. Well, not for the first time, but something that could be the core for upcoming big titles. And I'm also speaking more about like the action RPG genre, since this resembles a lot the Zelda games, but actually has leveling up systems, magics and spells, and a character that you form the game around. Well, the box of the game says that it's made by SNK and shows off a fighter in a world with a sword and epic graphics. Well, on the game itself it does not look the same, let's say that. So looking at it so many years later, it's just the same as with a lot of other Nintendo games, where the box art truly does not display what the game is about, and it has very little to do with it, and that's pretty funny. Well, basically the storyline is that you wake up as the chosen hero to defend the world after a nuclear disaster or a weapon disaster, pretty much like a Fallout game. So it's a post-apocalyptic adventure, but here it's more of a fantasy setting with magics and spells and swords and that sort of style, which actually gives a little bit of a fresh touch in my opinion, even though at the time they didn't have the necessary writing to make a game like this, and usually the story is told in a very easy way, like full front out and with very little immersion in itself, which limits the appeal of the story in itself. That is actually quite interesting, but as I said, doesn't really come out that well in this age and this technique. But a really interesting try, and the aspiration to create something bigger than usually is, in my opinion, a strong point of this game. Well, the gameplay itself has a lot of flaws, but is basically the same as a Zelda game, but with a lot more stats. And the problem in itself is that the stats are usually not necessary. It's just as fun to not have this amount of leveling up, this grinding, this menu systems. But at the same time, I don't really mind doing it. And as a first try, I think that there are some interesting aspects to it, that like the simplicity of having a system where 3 hits is enough to kill something, but if you level up 2 times it's 2 hits instead. That you have like an attack and a defense value that you compare to each other, and that you also have certain spells that you can manage to plan out your adventure, like for instance the spell to restore your life, which is basically needed in longer caves and dungeons, which is well, the management aspect of this is what the core mechanics of an RPG game is. So a lot of interesting game mechanics that were introduced in this game that could have made it a successful game, but it's broken down by like a turbo controller that is needed, because you'll be hitting and hitting and hitting everything so many times, and the mechanics of that you can hit as you walk makes the game pretty much easy with a turbo controller, since you can hold the attack button. And then another thing that is pretty annoying is that they wanted to make the game interesting with that you have different elements that you add to your weapon when you're attacking, but the problem is that you have to change your weapon all the time for the different enemies, and encounter is not really one challenge in itself. An encounter takes like a couple of seconds, and it's not much of a challenge more than poking them with a sword. That makes it pretty much uninteresting to switch between like a air sword and a fire sword every single time you face a new enemy, which takes a couple of seconds. So there's like a couple of seconds in the menu, couple of seconds fighting, menu, fighting, menu, fighting, and this was a big bummer in this game. It suits a system better if the fighting would have been turn-based, and the fighting mechanics and the planning makes more sense with those types of element aspects, but it is interesting, I must say. And to take all of these things, this epic management of your character, to have this many elements of gameplay into one such a game for such an era in the 1990s, as of course role-playing games was not unfamiliar with, but on a Nintendo Entertainment System, and combining this into an action RPG like this is really interesting. Other mechanics that usually doesn't work is to charge up your sword, almost like in Mega Man, to give them special attacks, which I usually very seldom use, except for when I want to open up new paths and stuff where it is a necessity. Getting new items, exploring, looking at the world, this is all fun and all, but it doesn't really represent that post-apocalyptic feeling that I would want from it. But nonetheless, it has a lot of impressive graphics for its time, and everything is so clear, and that they have all of these effects and all the colors. It just makes me happy to look at. Together with combination with boss fights and unique enemies, things that you haven't really seen before. Of course, they have the cliche ones too, and stuff that are just there because they needed more material, but it just gives you that feeling that this was a big aspirating project to become the new type of action RPG, and it really does stand out pretty well, especially for that time. And the sound is also pretty impressive. There are songs and beats that, well, it doesn't match the setting and doesn't really match the gameplay, but it really does give you that Nintendo 8-bit feeling that you really remember from this era. So overall, this is one of those games that are actually a hidden gem, but it doesn't stand that well today. Nonetheless, if you like these kinds of games and this kind of gameplay, especially if you like Zelda or action RPGs, you should go down to 1992, the roots, to look at Crystalis. And actually there are some things that a lot of developers could check here and like, yeah, these are good ideas, keep it simple, build it from the core, and then we take it on. And now when we have different techniques, the new types of storytelling, of course Crystalis has a lot of these things that there could have been something, but just didn't get it out there at that time. So that is a real big bummer, but at the same time, for what it is, like an easy pick up and play, it goes fast. With a turbo controller, it is so much fun. I'd say that with all the bosses, with the type of gameplay, it's well worth to try it. And if you can find it for a decent price, it's one of those games that you should actually play. And if you're an RPG fan, definitely. But it's not that fun anymore. Actually, sometimes the grinding and like going on and on and on like this might make you like think a little bit why you're not playing Zelda, and that is the most, like, the biggest problem of the game, whereas all of these things that they added to it is actually not needed for the time being, but that doesn't really make make the game less interesting, just that today it doesn't stand out as good. But it is one of those games that is so much fun as a game reviewer to look at and just compare to so many other things, especially at that time but also today, and see like how things were formed. And it's just one of those experiments that I think that, like, if you're an aspiring game designer, a game reviewer, or just want to know about games overall, this is one of those titles that, if you have seen my video, of course, you get a lot of the information you need, but just to touch it for a couple of hours is something that I really think you should do, so you get that kind of interesting feeling. Note to thyself though, there are some of those old school, like, what the fuck do I do now elements of this game. Like, seriously, sometimes the puzzles, or whatever you want to call them, it's like, yeah, you have to go there, do this and this, then something happens, and then you have this black hole and you don't get like any information unless you try all possible like different ways to do it, and then if you do this, then something happens there. Whereas if you go there before this happens, well, it's just a black hole in the screen and you're like, okay. So those are really annoying, and I recommend using a guide for this because it makes no sense, and that's the kind of Nintendo logics that was at this time. And to end this review, I would like to add the grade of like a strong 6, even though of course there are some shortages, it's still fun to play, and taking it for what it is. Until next time, Undertaker out.